Well, hello there. If you're here today, you're here to learn about the guy who invented the detective story, Edgar Allan Poe. Here we have our man Edgar. He was born January 19th in 1809, and he died on October 7th in 1849 when he was just 40 years old. Poe led a very tragic life. When he was a kid, his mom, who was a famous actress in her town, died of tuberculosis, and he was adopted by the Poe family, and that's how he has the last name, Edgar Allan Poe. If you want to learn more about Edgar Allan Poe and his strange life, there are a whole lot of resources for you, both on YouTube and through Google searches. We are here today to talk about Poe's theories of detective fiction, since he is the person who invented the genre. So when it comes to the crime, if there are murders, they occur in a seemingly locked room. No one should have been able to get in or out of the room. And no matter what the crime is, no one sees it take place. If someone were to see the crime take place, then we would have a witness who could say, oh, I know who committed this crime. And then we would know right away, and the story wouldn't be too interesting of a read. There's also an innocent suspect. So in detective fiction, you have 5 main characters: the detective sidekick, the criminal, the innocent suspect, and the victim. And there is always an innocent suspect, and at the beginning, motive, access, and other surface evidence point to this innocent suspect. This is to help throw the reader off track and prevent the reader from solving the crime they're reading about before the detective reveals who committed the crime. The clues are simple. So we're not going to see a whole lot of complex clues, though in later detective fiction, once we get into DNA and fingerprints and crime scene investigation, clues in real life become more complex. But in a detective fiction, the clues are relatively simple. So the detective is usually an eccentric detective, but also brilliant. So when we think of the most famous detective, Sherlock Holmes, he wasn't a professional detective in that it wasn't his job. He didn't get paid for it. He was an amateur detective. He didn't work for a police force or a detective agency. He went out and solved crimes because regular people asked him to solve crimes. Not only is he brilliant, but he's also eccentric. And our definition of eccentric is a person of unconventional and slightly strange views or behavior. Synonyms of eccentric are odd, strange, peculiar, weird, bizarre, outlandish, freakish, and extraordinary. When it comes to solving the crime, because the detective is brilliant and eccentric, the detective is able to use some unexpected means to produce the solution. So the appeal in the solution lies in the fact that all of the clues and all of the story doesn't make sense until the detective reveals who the criminal is. At which point, that last puzzle piece falls into place and the reader goes, oh yeah, it must be this person because of, and then looking back at the work that the author has created, the criminal becomes the logical person to have done it. But we're only able to realize that once the detective has revealed who the criminal is. There is a sidekick. This is the second of the big 5 characters in detective fiction, as I call them. There is a sidekick or listener or worker for the clever detective. In Sherlock Holmes, that's Dr. Watson. This is important because if the detective were working on his or her own, then the detective wouldn't have anybody to share ideas with and bounce ideas with. And so the The purpose of the sidekick is to give the detective someone to talk to about their thought process and show how much smarter the detective is than the sidekick. So in detective fiction, the police are unable to solve the crime. They're not as smart as the amateur detective, and as a result, they are unable to figure out who committed the crime. Because the detective is an amateur and smarter, the police are resentful of the amateur detective's interference. And they do not want to share information with the amateur detective or the crime scene or any of their clues. And there's usually an antagonistic relationship between the amateur detective and the character of a police officer in detective fiction. So in detective fiction, there is a careful but simple solution of the problems through logic and intuition. The detective is able to piece the clues together logically and follow his or her or their gut feeling to produce the solution. And the solution only makes sense once the author has revealed it to the reader. So in good detective fiction, the reader should not be able to solve the crime that was committed in the book before the detective reveals the answer.